A little while back, I made a video titled the top 5 almost broken Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and in today's video, I want to talk about 5 more cards that I feel could have been broken or have the potential to be broken. Now, a lot of times, these sort of cards are not broken for 2 reasons. The first reason is that they were released at the wrong time, either too early or too late. And the second reason is that they have one glaring weakness in their effect that's really holding them back from competition. Now, none of these cards have really been played that much in competitive play or even in rogue play, so that's what makes them so interesting, that they're on this spectrum between sort of broken cards and bad cards. They're about right in the middle where they're almost broken, but they're definitely not there yet. And let's start off with Victoria. So this card saw some fringe play in early Chaos Dragon builds way back in 2012, but other than that, it really hasn't come up anywhere. Now this card's pretty cool. It has all around good stats. It's a light fairy, level 4, 1800 attack. Every single one of those is pretty relevant, and it has 2 effects. So the first effect says once per turn you can target one dragon type monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon that target to your side of the field. So it's sort of like one half of a Monster Reborn, but only for dragon monsters. And the second effect is your opponent cannot target face-up fairy type monsters for attacks except this one. Now I have 2 comments here. The first one is going to be on the lightning rod effect. So this is the only thing your opponent can attack if you have fairy monsters on the board. So that means your other fairy monsters are protected. Your opponent has to attack the Victoria. Here's the problem. Victoria is a card that is continuously gaining you advantage, and it's one that you want to remain on the field for as long as possible. So why does it have this lightning rod ability? In my opinion, Victoria would be a lot better if it couldn't be attacked as long as you controlled other fairy monsters. That seems to make a lot more sense. And if we look at the revival effect, the comment I have about that one is that generally speaking, cards that force your opponent to make plays for you to actually use them are going to be worse than cards that you can simply activate when you're going first or when your opponent doesn't have a board. So Victoria requires a lot of things to happen. It requires your opponent to be playing dragons, of course. You probably would never main deck this card simply because your opponent has to be playing a lot of dragons just to be useful. Your opponent has to have a dragon in the graveyard when you summon this, and your opponent has to have a relevant dragon in the graveyard. No one wants to revive Red Eye's Bee Chick with this card. They want to revive Red Eye's Darkness Metal Dragon with it. So that means that a lot of things have to go right for Victoria to even be usable, and at that point, it's still not that good. I think one way you could fix this with the revival effect is to make the revival effect also work on your own monsters. Now, this probably would have been too good back when this card came out, but I think nowadays if we got a retrained version, I'm not even sure a deck like Blue Eyes would play it, although it would be pretty cool. So I think that's like the 2 things that I want to see change with Victoria, is that it can revive your own monsters, and also that it can't be attacked when you control other fairies. Now, number 4 is a card that I've talked about before, but I'll mention it again. Rebound. This card's really cool for a lot of reasons. I thought this card was going to be very good, and I know people always say you can side this card against Yosenjis, you can side this card against Spirits, you can side this card against Firewall Dragon, but the fact of the matter is, in every single one of those cases, there's a better card to play instead of Rebound. So let's read its effect. When your opponent activates a spell card, trap card, or monster effect that returns a card from the field to the hand, negate that effect, and if you do, send one card from your opponent's hand at random or from their side of the field to the graveyard. And then its second effect is when the set card is destroyed by your opponent's card effect and sent to the graveyard, draw 1 card. So what do you side this against? Well, you can play it against those decks that I just listed, but what you really need to play this card against is a deck that always has bouncing effects, and that those bouncing effects give them advantage. See, the problem against Yosenjus and Spirits is that there's no reason that you should wait until the end of the turn to actually do anything to stop their plays. Just play like a Mere Forest. Just play a Torrential Tribute to kill all their monsters instead of waiting until they bounce back to the hand. Now with Firewall Dragon, there's simply just cards like Solemn Strike that exist, but I think Rebound does have potential, and I do think that the second effect is incredibly relevant as well, because a lot of times the problem with trap cards like this that are really specific in activation is that if your opponent destroys them before you use them, you sort of miss out on an opportunity to negate their cards. But this card instantly gives you a draw if your opponent happened to like Twin Twist it, which I think is really good, and there aren't a lot of trap cards like that nowadays. There simply aren't cards that replace themselves when they're destroyed face down, so I think that's really cool card design, and I think all Rebound will need to be this is maybe stretching it, but I really do think that all Rebound needs to be good is for there to be a deck that all they do is sort of cycle their cards from the field back to the hand to like special summon other cards from their hand, and all they're doing is just self-bouncing their own cards, not with cost, of course, which is kind of the tricky part because this has to be used on effects. But I think if that happens, Rebound has potential. Until then, probably not. Number 3 is Pot of Acquisitiveness. Now that is a pretty tough word to say, and this card actually isn't that old, and it did see play in the OCG, but it only saw play in the TCG for like 2 weeks after it came out. Now this card is pretty cool, and I think it actually outlines the problem with like pot cards in general sometimes when they come out, because a lot of people look at Pot of Avarice and say, well, how is that card ever allowed? But believe it or not, when Pot of Avarice came out, it was actually difficult to put 5 monsters in the graveyard. That cost that we now see as like the broken part of the effect used to be like a real cost. It was really tricky to put 5 monsters in your graveyard, and a lot of times you would dead draw the Pot of Avarice. Now that doesn't make any sense in the context of current Yu-Gi-Oh! Of course you can put 5 monsters in your graveyard in like one turn, probably multiple times, so that's crazy. But I think we can look at Pot of Acquisitiveness in the same way. It's not easy for most decks to banish 3 monsters and still be able to make their plays. And Pot of Acquisitiveness, sorry, it's like so hard to say, could be really good if there's a deck that banishes cards and wants to cycle them back in the deck. Pretty much the only deck that could play this card was ABC's, and even then it didn't really have a consistent finish in the TCG, which tells me that this card simply just doesn't have a deck that fits it yet. Now I will say, if this card did draw 2 cards, it would be absolutely insane, and I'm pretty glad that they didn't give it that effect, because then it would just be crazy. But I think it still has potential as an Upstart Goblin that recycles your card if there ever is like a deck that is constantly banishing their own cards. Very similar to what Rebound is good against. If there's like a deck where they're always bouncing their cards, Pot of Acquisitiveness could be good in a deck that is constantly banishing their own cards. Now, one deck that I have tried to fit this in many times before is Frogs, because Frogs have a lot of different banishes with Rodent Totem, and I think it's pretty slick to sort of put 3 banished swap Frogs or 3 banished dupe Frogs back in your deck for a free draw. But the problem is this card is not good on turn 1 in a Frog deck, and pretty much these days you have to be playing cards that are good on turn 1. But I think if there's a deck that's like crazy good at banishing, this card could see play. Now, number 2 is a card that I am very fond of, and I actually own 3 secret rare copies, just in case there's ever a deck that can play it, and that is Recurring Nightmare. Now, I think there's actually a Magic the Gathering card with the same name, which is kind of funny. But anyway, this thing is really, really straightforward. All you do is target 2 dark monsters with 0 defense in your graveyard, add those targets to your hand. It's like a no-cost double monster reincarnation. So what's the issue with this card? Well, how many good 0 defense dark monsters can you name off the top of your head? Now, I'm not saying there aren't any good ones. There's like Unizombie, and I believe Shaddoll Dragon has 0 defense. But in general, there's not like a whole good deck full of 0 defense dark monsters that you can really abuse with Recurring Nightmare. However, and this is why this card's almost broken, if there ever is a deck full of 0 defense dark monsters that send themselves to the graveyard a lot, or synchro summon a lot, or link summon a lot, or XYZ summon a lot, this card will be broken. Mark my words. It is a non-once per turn double monster reincarnation with 0 cost. All it takes is for a deck to be built around it, and I think this card could have the potential to be insane. Now, we don't have one of those yet, but we're getting there, and we're really getting closer with every release, because a card like Unizombie is a perfect card to abuse with this. Now, if only we had another 0 defense zombie to add back. And I can kind of see this card being argued to play in Skull Servants. It does have some good targets there, but that deck simply doesn't yard enough monsters, and it doesn't even really want to add back the 0 defense dark monsters. So I think it has to be something else, although I'll keep that in the back of my mind if a new Skull Servant card gets released with 0 defense that's a dark monster. Now, if a White Princess was a dark monster instead of a light monster, maybe this card would have been crazy. But as it stands right now, it simply doesn't have a deck it can go in, which leaves it in a really awkward spot. But definitely watch out for this card. It has very few printings, and I wouldn't be surprised if the secret rare copy shot up in price someday just because it's the only holographic version of the card. There's only 2 common printings, and 1 secret rare printing, and that secret rare printing is really old and hard to come by. Number 1, and this might surprise you because I don't actually like this deck, but it is Cyber Network. Now this is a card that was released in the Cyber Dragon structure deck, and I thought this card was going to be crazy because it has the potential to do so much in terms of card advantage. It's basically a slower return from a different dimension. Now I don't know if that's going to sell it to you, but let's read its effect. Destroy this card during your 3rd standby phase. Now that might sound bad, but it is good because this card wants to be destroyed. It's kind of weird. Once per turn, if Cyber Dragon is on your field, you can banish 1 light machine monster from your deck. So that's sort of like the setup. It's not a plus or a minus in card economy. It just gets a card out of your deck. When this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, special summon as many of your banished light machine monsters as possible, and if you do, destroy all spell and traps you control. Monsters that were special summoned by this effect cannot activate their effects. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn after you the turn you activate this effect. So what are the upsides of this card? Well, the upside is that if this thing's destroyed while you have 5 banished light machine monsters, you are special summoning 5 banished light machine monsters, and that has the potential to be absolutely insane. We can look at this deck in the context of a Cyber Dragon deck, where you could turn those cards into like a Cyber Dragon Infinity, but you can also look at this card in like a crazy Cyber Dragon ABC hybrid, because ABCs are really good at banishing their monsters, and surely by the time this card is destroyed, you can get 3 pieces banished, and that would turn this card into an ABC Buster Dragon. Now, what are the downsides? I don't think the downside, or I don't think the drawback of the cards not being able to activate their effects is a big downside. I think there are plenty of cards like this that if they had that restriction would still be very broken. I mean, if Return from a Different Dimension said that, still a broken card. The real downside of this card, I think the reason this card didn't see any play, is that you can't enter your battle phase during the turn you activate this effect. Now, I know Soul Charge also has a restriction, but Soul Charge takes a lot less setup and is a lot faster and a lot more generic. For this card to have that on it, I mean, I understand from Konami's standpoint that they don't want to give Cyber Dragons just an instant win button, but I think it might be interesting to see how powerful this card would be if you took off that restriction. It might even be enough to make Cyber Dragons a viable strategy. Now, I don't know that, but I think if this card had that restriction taken off of it when it came out, they absolutely would have been a dominant rogue strategy. Probably not. They're probably still too inconsistent to be like a truly competitive tier 1 strategy, but in terms of a rogue status, I think that this card would have been really good in a Cyber Dragon deck without that battle phase restriction. It would have given them some pretty cheesy wins at the very least. But anyway, that's going to wrap up my list. Now I've talked about 10 almost broken cards. Make sure to go check out the first video if you want to talk about, or if you want to hear me talk about 5 other almost broken cards. Maybe your favorite one didn't make this list, but it made that other list. I'm not quite sure, but I will see you guys later. Bye.